The vampire community is a community with a history, and something I've begun to realize in this age of YouTube videos and Facebook fan groups. I'm one of the few people who still has a lot of this history in my possession. I have a great deal of correspondence, publications, magazines, newsletters, and first editions of things that are relevant and important to the vampire community, all archived in my possession. I was identifying with the vampire as an archetype in high school in the late 80s. When I went to college in 1991 is when I first began to actively communicate, correspond, and interact with other people who identified as vampires. One of the things that inspired me to start my own magazine, Shadow Dance, was Necropolis by Chad Savage. Some people will recognize that name because Chad Savage is the evil artistic mastermind behind Sinister Visions, and he's a very big name in the haunted attraction industry these days. I knew Chad through Necropolis, which was his fanzine. Ran across it at LaGrange Con, which was, I think, the first fandom convention I ever went to. It was a sci-fi, largely Star Trek convention. Went with another geek and Doctor Who fan from high school. I wouldn't have ever gone if he hadn't dragged me along. And there were a number of little fanzines there. Mark Williams, Onyx, and I think there was one called Noctem Eternus, and Necropolis is the one, partly because of Savage's just amazing use of the art of Gustave Doré. His work just captivated me, and that was really, in a lot of ways, the inspiration for my own magazine, Shadow Dance. These are later issues. I started it in 1991. I still have the initial issue kicking around, but quite honestly, it's not much to look at. It was put together with, by hand cut and paste, and then copied on a Xerox machine. Like Chad Savage, I made a lot of use of clip art in an artistic fashion, but there was a lot of great talent as well. Kim Traub, who has these just fascinating little black and white illustrations. She's also someone who's gone on to really establish herself as an artist from the small press days. Here's some more of the fan art. The fanzines at this time, it was catch as catch can. It's like any kind of thing produced for fandom. Here's a cover by Mr. Savage himself, actually. We did what we could with what we had, and the fanzines like Shadow Dance were not strictly real vampire publications. They were an homage in many ways to the vampire as an archetype, as well as to the Gothic literary genre. But there were so many. One of the ones that was formative and very influential to the New York City vampire scene was Eric S. Held's Vampire Information Exchange newsletter. This is a later one, April 1995. And I remember seeing listings for it in some of the zines as early as 91. I can't actually tell you when he founded Vane. I do know that Gene Youngston's Dracula archives were early and influential things. They weren't necessarily real vampire explicit. Martin V. Ricardo's Institute of Vampire Studies also was another influential thing. Again, real vampires were participants in it, but most of these were not exclusively devoted to real vampires. Some of the underground press things were, And some of them it's a little hard to tell. I mean, there's a kind of a mishmash of real vampire and fandom, and that really typifies the late 80s and the early 90s for, where the community started. Folks who identified as vampires could only find an expression of that interest in vampire fandom. Here is a flyer for a book signing in '96 for Something in the Blood. And I was still actually in the coffin at the time. I did not participate in this book as a real vampire. I participated in this book only as a vampire researcher. One of the key pieces of information that I gave Jeff Gwynne access to was a vampire census, which I had run through the International Society of Vampires. So we had very early demographics of people who identified as vampires throughout the U.S. and the world. The vampire, the ISV, International Society of Vampires, was something that was an outgrowth of shadow dance and of a lot of correspondence that went on behind the scenes with shadow dance. And its newsletter was the Midnight Sun. Now, the thing about the Midnight Sun, there is this archives here that collects all of the stuff for the International Society of Vampires. It is, in a lot of ways, a prototype for what we recognize now as the discussions that go on internet forums and e-groups, and these days on Facebook groups. People would join up, post their postal information so other people could write to them. I mean, almost everything is done through physical mail. It's, in some ways, the newsletters were almost a formalized pen pal network. Actually, that was the vampire census. I'm just sort of, 1997, there's the next census. I had folks from all over Germany, Turkey, Japan, not just the States, not just Canada. And, I mean, the Midnight Sun was a combination of serious stuff, reviews. This is one of the first places where you see Strigoi and Moroi mentioned. I'm pretty sure it's actually where a certain someone got the idea, because the actual book, a master's or PhD treatise by Harry Sen, is a fairly obscure book where he goes into the concept of living vampires. Speaking of certain someones, here, Cornelius, here's a curious cat who thinks he absolutely, totally needs to be in the middle of this video. Oh, the things that I do to put up with you, cat. Move. Here is actually the first time that I really had my attention brought to Sebastian and the New York City scene. This is the Vampire Almanac from 1998. The copy was brought to my attention by Joseph Vargo of Monolith Graphics, because I had done research for their Gothic art calendar, and there's a calendar in the back here which has, the exact same dates, and some of those dates were made up. Night of the Raven, particularly in November, is actually Joseph Vargo's birthday. It's one of the ways that he knew that the information was kind of lifted word for word from his calendar, because all of the friends' birthdays, which he had given a specific title, Night of the Raven, Night of the Satyr, they were lifted wholesale without explanation, and this inspired me to get in contact with the folks in the New York scene. Not much explanation was given for how the entire contents of the Monolith Graphics art calendar dates ended up without any kind of, crediting into the Vampire Almanac. And it might seem a little counterintuitive, but the next time an almanac came out, I was actively involved in writing it. in large part because that guaranteed that my name was actually associated with the things that I had written. Now, the first time that I was in the New York scene actually was for the release of the Vampire Almanac here. It was September 2000. I had no idea at the time how lucky I was that it was September 2000 and not September 2001. It was around about the same time, almost a year to the date before all the shit hit the fan with the towers. I almost didn't make it out. I, at the time, just did not have the funds to make a trip. I mean, 8 hours to New York from Ohio just seems so far, which it's just funny now to think about. But the thing was, is he hooked me up with this gothabilly rock band based out of Cleveland called the Cult of the Psychic Fetus. I kid you not, the Cult of the Psychic Fetus. And they were driving out to perform anyway, so I met up with them in Cleveland and pretty much hitched a ride, paid for a tank of gas, and came out with them to the release party here. And, way back in the day, and there's House Keperu. Now, the funny thing was, a long time before I was involved with the New York vampire community, around about the same time I was doing a lot of the shadow dance stuff. And one of the things that you'll see with Necropolis as well is there's a little bit of vampire fandom, but also one of the things that Chad Savage was doing for shadow dance later in the days of the magazine was writing a column on White Wolf and White Wolf games. While the real vampire community is not about role-playing, I mean, goodness, most of us met one another in Real Vampires No RPG, which was an AOL chat room in 1996. I mean, I met so many people. Stephen O'Malley, other people who I think would be happy if I didn't mention their names, but you couldn't split one from the other. And really, if you understand the New York scene, the court of Gotham that had a sheriff and a regent, it's very obvious how Sabretooth first started off as. And in a lot of ways, it was maybe a logical step for some people who were fascinated with the vampire archetype, who came to it first through role-playing. But certainly for the lifestylers and the fashion vamps, you can't cut the influence of Vampire the Masquerade away from the vampire community. The whole structure in New York, with all the houses and the courts, the regent, the sheriffs, even the Black Veil, it's all lifted from the early existence of it as a LARP. The first Endless Night is advertised in Realms of Fantasy magazine as a vampire LARP. Does this invalidate the influence, the reality, the significance of it? I don't think that it does. Does it muddy the waters for some people who come to this not as a role-playing thing and really need it to not have that influence? It does make it difficult for some people, I think. But I think it's important to understand that when White Wolf was a big thing, when the Vampire LARPs, the live-action role-playing games were big, that was the only social outlet that most of us who identified as real vampires and had been identifying as real vampires, it was the only social outlet we had. We could go to goth clubs and hang out with people who were romanced with the idea of the vampire, or we could go to Vampire the Masquerade games, get our vamp on, have some fun playing, and then maybe be able to discuss what real vampires might mean. And to be honest, people who are fascinated with the vampire from a fandom perspective make good donors. You don't have that awkward, okay, so are you into vampires? Not everybody is. And you have an automatic an automatic end, an automatic talking point with someone who is fascinated and romanced with the vampire. What we're looking at here is the 2003 precursor to V, the Book of the Strigoi V. It's, as you can see, it's in a 3-ring binder. Endless Night that year in New Orleans, Father Sebastian, Todd, whatever name he's going by this year, he did not have copies ready in time for the thing, and he still wanted to be able to sell them. So he has the very first book of Vampire, and he just had printouts, and he put them in these 3-ring binders and was selling them, I think, for $50 a pop. And maybe it was 2002. Yeah, no, shit, sorry. This was 2002. Because 2003 was when the Strigoi V book came out, V. And, I mean, yeah, we even have some stuff here handwritten into it. I have my early letter to Sebastian with the rewrite of the Black Veil that was the 13 Rules of Community, and some commentary back and forth, Sanguinarium Manifesto, references to Kovica. The thing to keep in mind for everybody who is active in the online vampire community or the real-time vampire community now is, you know, I realize that the late 80s and the early 90s seems like the Stone Age to a lot of people, but there is a history. There's documentation. You can track the development, the intertwined quality between vampire fandom, vampire pop culture, vampire roleplay, and vampire reality, and see us through all of this as we develop our own identity, learn to believe in ourselves, and become something much, much bigger.